Hey, so I thought I would talk a little bit about how carbon cycles through the environment today. Okay, and in this I made a graphic to kind of help out with understanding how exactly that happens. So the plant that we're going to start with is just some type of grass. Now, the reason we're starting with a plant is because plants do something special that animals cannot do, and that is photosynthesis. They have these organelles called chloroplasts, as you might remember, and these chloroplasts have the ability to take CO2, water, and sunlight and make sugars out of that. Now those sugars are going to be used not only for the plant's food, but also those sugars are used to construct the actual body of the plant itself. Yeah, the large portion of grass is actually made of sugar, and that is derived from doing photosynthesis. Now those sugars are not going to be just what the plant depends upon, but actually the entire ecosystem depends on those sugars. Now, it's more than just about carbon. The entire ecosystem actually depends on the grasses to store energy from the sun. And those sugars are storing the energy from the sun. But let's not talk energy right now. Let's just talk about matter. Because when it comes to matter and energy in environmental science, they are different things. Of course, Einstein talked about how they're the same thing, but that's physics. This is environmental science. And for you guys to understand this, let's separate energy and matter and just think of them as different things, just to make it easier on you. So as it says on the side there, carbon will be absorbed from the atmosphere. Here is supposed to be the atmosphere during photosynthesis, and it will form the majority of the biomass in the ecosystem. And biomass is essentially the weight of all living matter within an ecosystem. You could be particular and just talk about the biomass of grasses, or you could talk about the general biomass of the entire ecosystem, and that can actually go beyond just grasses itself, such as bison and maybe like dairy cows and whatever. But for now, we're just talking grasses. We're going to say that not only do these grasses suck in CO2 during photosynthesis, but also they respire CO2. As you probably know, plants breathe out oxygen, but they also have mitochondria that breathe out CO2. So here is the plant breathing out CO2, it going into the air, and it taking that CO2 back in, because that's kind of the special trick plants do. Because of photosynthesis, they not only breathe out CO2, but they can take in CO2, and once again make their bodies from it. I guess this is as good a time as any to kind of just bring up the fact that, once again, this is called a cycle because the carbon is actually cycling here. It's moving out, and then it's going back in, and you can see it's like a circle, right? Just cycling. Cycling. You can see it here. Cycling. Because it's the carbon cycle. And although I'm just going to be talking about how carbon cycles, it's important to realize that all matter cycles through an environment to some degree. Now, carbon is a little more mobile than other elements on the periodic table in the ecosystems on planet Earth. But just kind of keep that in mind, that there are many different cycles. There's the nitrogen cycle, which if we haven't talked about it, we will. There is the phosphorus cycle, which if we haven't talked about it, we will. There's many different cycles. Water cycle, for example. And if we haven't talked about it, we will. So there's a couple of things going on in this diagram. First of all, you're noticing that there's different sized arrows. Well, the different sized arrows are supposed to represent how much biomass is moving. You can see here that the carbon, the biomass of carbon, here is a thinner arrow. Here's actually a pretty thick arrow. We'll talk about why it's so thick in a little bit. And then here's another arrow right here that's a little more thick. Well, these arrows are supposed to show you where this original biomass in this entire grass population within an environment, that's what this square is supposed to represent. It's supposed to represent all the grass in an environment. Well, all this biomass, some of it, the thinner arrow, will go up into the air, back as CO2. Maybe it will be breathed back into a plant, but this thinner arrow is supposed to represent it going up into the air as CO2. This thicker arrow is supposed to show you that a larger majority or a larger amount of the biomass is not respired, but is actually dropped out when the grasses die. And where does all that biomass go? Hopefully, if you've guessed, when grass dies, it doesn't just vaporize, it goes to a group of organisms called decomposers. They will eat the dead grass, that biomass. They will take it into their body. Look at how big this decomposer box is. That is because there is a lot of biomass in decomposers. We might have talked about in class that roughly 80% of Earth's biomass are made of microbes or single-celled organisms. And if we haven't talked about it, we will. Well, those decomposers will take in the grass's biomass. Now, decomposers only have mitochondria. And as we said, that's an organelle inside them. If the decomposer is a bacteria, it won't have that organelle, the mitochondria, because it's a prokaryote, if you remember. But they will still respire CO2 back into the air when eating that grass's biomass. There you go. So, we have this arrow showing you that in the decomposers, they will respire the sugars that were eaten. It's a truck just went by. Anyway, the sugars that were in the grasses get taken in by the decomposers, and that which was not made, that which the decomposer didn't make their bodies out of, that carbon will be respired back into the air as CO2. But, as you might imagine, it's not just decomposers that exist in an ecosystem. What a sad ecosystem that would be. Hopefully there's some other things besides just decomposers in that ecosystem, and they too would like some of that biomass that the grass has. This is a good time to bring up, I'm using the word biomass pretty loosely here. Remember, biomass, the real definition is the total mass of organisms in a given area. Now, if I'm just talking about carbon, there is definitely more than just carbon in biomass. There's hydrogen, oxygen, trace minerals, and things like iron and that type of stuff. So when I'm saying biomass, really what I'm referring to is the amount of carbon in the environment. I'm not really talking about biomass, but I think that biomass is just kind of a easy to understand term. I'm especially using the word biomass wrong if I'm going to describe CO2 as biomass. Really, once again, I'm really meaning by biomass the amount of carbon in the environment. For the word biomass is the total mass of organisms, and carbon dioxide is definitely not an organism. It's a puff of air. So yeah, I'm not using that word right, but I think it kind of gets the point across that we're talking about the weight of carbon. And although carbon is a common component of biomass, it is technically not biomass. And here you go. Let's say that the grasses, their biomass has also gone into this bison. And you're noticing that the bison rectangle is far smaller than the grasses was. And that's because usually only, 10% of the biomass from one trophic level is passed to the next trophic level. The 90% that was not accounted for is being respired, or it's going to the decomposers, who will then respire it back into the air. So only 10% for the next trophic level here. This would be a primary consumer because it is the first to consume. It's the first to eat a producer. Now, as far as the biomass inside the bison goes, it could do a couple of things with that biomass. Now remember, this is just not one bison. This is supposed to be like all the bison. This is all the biomass of bison in an environment. Well, there's a couple of things those bisons can do. They can either die and go to the decomposers again. You're noticing why the decomposer line is as thick as it is now, right? Because look at all the biomass going into it. The grasses have gone into it. Now the bisons are all dead and going into it. But another thing the bison can do with the atoms, the carbon biomass it got from the grasses, it can also respire that into the air, because bison also have mitochondria in them. And they are burning sugars gotten from the grasses, and those sugars are turning into CO2, which are being respired into the atmosphere. But that's not all. Bison might also be eaten by a wolf. Now this is a very small little wolf here. And that's because there's not many wolves in an environment. Because remember, all that biomass that was in the bison is not going into the wolf. It's only this small sliver. 10% is moving to the next trophic level, where 90% is either going to decomposers or being respired into the air. Now, assuming there are no hunters of wolves and humans haven't, started getting a taste for wolf meat, they are what we call the top predator, or the alpha predator. And so they're not going to be eaten by any other organism, but what could happen to all the biomass, although little as it is, what could happen to all that biomass is it could go back to the decomposers as the wolves die. Or all those carbon atoms could be respired because wolves also have mitochondria. So, what holds the largest amount of biomass? Well, decomposers hold a lot of biomass. in an environment. The air holds a lot of that carbon latent biomass. Plants also carry a lot of that biomass. But through the trophic levels, there's less and less biomass. And the arrows are showing you, once again, how much biomass is being moved. These wolves, for example, their biomass is either in the wolf population that's alive, or it goes to the decomposers, or it gets respired. The biomass in the bisons was far bigger to begin with, so their arrows are a little bigger. There's the respiring arrow. There's the amount of biomass going to the decomposers there. And here's all the biomass going to the wolves. So in this ecosystem, we have grass, bison, wolves, and decomposers. And we are just following that carbon-filled biomass around the ecosystem. And you can see that it truly does deserve the title of a cycle, because that carbon is always being cycled. No matter where you go, it's eventually going to be cycled, right? This is one of the most simple cycles on here. But maybe the grasses die and then they go here, and the carbon is breathed out by the decomposers and then it goes there. Or maybe the grass biomass goes to the bison and then it's breathed up and back to the grasses. Or maybe it goes to the bison and then it goes to the decomposers, which is breathed out and goes back to the grasses, goes to the wolves, go down, decomposes, breathe it out. But it's a cycle. No matter what road you take, it eventually leads back to the air, and if there's any photosynthetic organisms containing chloroplasts that will do photosynthesis, then the cycle will continue in the manner I had just showed you.